So we're going to continue our lecture on the atypical sexual behaviors chapter by discussing the coercive or non-consenting paraphilias. And just a reminder that any of the behaviors that we talked about in the last lecture could be defined as a paraphilia, meaning that we could diagnose it, but only if it's causing distress or dysfunction in the person's life. Typically, people engage in those behaviors without distress or dysfunction, but they might come to treatment if they do experience distress or dysfunction. From here on out, everything that we're talking about now is always going to be considered a paraphilia worthy of being diagnosed and treated. And one of the main reasons is because they're going to always cause distress and dysfunction. Sometimes to the person who's engaging the behavior, but very often to other people, the people that they perpetrate against. These are almost, with one exception, going to be considered sexual crimes. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about voyeurism and exhibitionism. And the first one, voyeurism. This is a term that a lot of people are familiar with, and it's just defined as when people get sexual arousal from viewing nude bodies or sexual acts. Now, in its less severe forms, it's fairly common. Half of adolescent males report, about half report peeping at one time or another in their lives. And so it's a fairly common adolescent behavior. And a lot of times individuals will engage in it kind of spying on neighbors, happening to see somebody with their window open. In the United States, it's not illegal to engage in voyeuristic behavior unless a person is trespassing. They're using photography, so they're capturing an image that they're going to keep, or if video recording is involved. Now, I want to take a break here and say that, when we're talking about voyeurism here, we're not talking about consensual voyeurism, or when individuals we're not talking about watching porn or engaging in consensual sort of group sex behavior where some people might be willingly letting you watch them have sex. Here we're talking really about the non-consensual aspect, and most voyeurs will get a thrill from the illicit, from the idea that the person doesn't know that they're being spied on, that they don't know that they're being viewed. So voyeurs that we're talking about here are kind of your classic peeping toms, somebody who is engaging in illicit, non-consenting activity and usually masturbating either at the time or masturbating later to memories of watching people undress or watching them engaged in sexual activity. Now, one of the big areas that voyeurism has been exploding really has been in video voyeurism. And there are a number of people, you guys have heard of famous cases. I want you to kind of think about it here for a second, of cases where you might have heard of people sort of releasing, either recording people against their will and then releasing those files online, or perhaps digging through people's hard drives iClouds, and capturing pictures of them and then posting them online. So these are examples of voyeurism, and it is true that these can be considered illegal acts if you can trace the people who are engaged in them. A very famous case from several years ago now was when Erin Andrews, who some of you may know as a ESPN football commentator, and she was sort of famously captured, I believe, in a hotel when she was staying in Germany. Somebody planted a video recorder in her hotel room and captured her undressing, and then released the videos online, and that person was prosecuted for that because of the video recording aspect to it. But just a kind of word of warning, if you are, in your house and you have your blinds up and someone is not on your property, they are legally allowed to, they're not going to get in legal trouble for peeping on you. So if that's not something that you want to engage in, you might want to close your windows and close your blinds. It becomes a paraphilia when it's an unsuspecting other. So when there's a peeping Tom, or I suppose in the way that any other paraphilia is diagnosed, if it causes distress or dysfunction to the individual themselves. Most people who present to treatment for voyeurism have gotten in legal trouble, and it's a condition of their usually probation. It's unusual for someone to actually go to jail for voyeurism. They usually get probation, and then a condition of treatment, a condition of their sentence is treatment. The onset of voyeurism is typically early puberty. And one of the things that correlational research would note is that, again, most voyeurs are men. In fact, most of the people that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the time, the vast majority are male. And so the research is largely done on men here. And so in the adolescent boys who then grow into adult men who have a paraphilia of voyeurism, they tend to grow up with very poor peer relationships, kind of loners, and they have few female friends or sisters, and so they don't have a lot of practice with female interaction. And so these are kids who maybe have difficulty becoming involved with an appropriate sexual relationship with females, and then engage in voyeuristic behaviors when puberty hits, because they have, a normal sex drive but have no access to potential partners. And most voyeurs statistically also are heterosexual. So heterosexual males, and so that makes their victims overwhelmingly females. Exhibitionism is sort of the flip side of the coin, but it is considered a more serious sexual crime or sexual violence. Exhibitionism is when a person will take sexual pleasure from exposing their genitals to others in inappropriate situations. And the sexual pleasure from exposing is often about that unsuspecting victim. Exhibitionists often sort of get aroused or stimulated by surprising someone, by the non-consensual aspect of it. They will get turned on by the surprise, the fear, the revulsion of their victims. Sometimes they will masturbate or engage in the sexual activity in front of their victims, but sometimes they will just expose themselves and then masturbate or have sexual activity later with the memory of it. This is what we call indecent exposure as a crime, and 30% of convicted sex crimes are exhibitionists. Exhibitionism is kind of taken a little bit more seriously criminally than voyeurism, because exhibitionists are sort of known to be more likely to reoffend than any other sex crime. By the time someone's gotten caught for exhibitionism and sent to jail or gotten jail time for it, they've done it, dozens of times, and they're very, very likely to reoffend. A third of those offenses, they reoffend with more serious assault, and so exhibitionism is sometimes considered to be a gateway crime to rape or pedophilia, depending on the chosen victim of the exhibitionism. 33% of college women in one study reported that they had been the victims of an exhibitionist attempt. So it's a fairly common, unfortunately, experience that people have. And usually when I talk about this in class, there are a couple examples that the women in the class give about friends or themselves or family members who have been the victims of an exhibitionistic crime. Again, we see an early adolescent onset with individuals who become exhibitionists having very poor social skills. They also tend to have a really poor relationship with parents. We see the beginnings of sort of conduct disordered activity with exhibitionism, that escalation of poor adolescent behavior largely. One subset of exhibitionism is called, the old version is called telephone scatologia, which is obscene phone calling. So this is when a person would call somebody and do the heavy breathing or engage in sexual talking over the phone, and this was, again, done to shock the person. The exhibitionist or the telephone scatologist would get off on the idea that someone was unsuspecting was on the other end of the phone call. And today we see sort of more high-tech versions of that using the internet with things like chat roulette at the very beginning, or sending people pictures of one's genitals when they don't want them and didn't ask for them. Just the dick pic, if you will. And again, just a point of reference for anybody in the class. Nobody, probably people don't want to see a picture of your genitals. You should always just bet on that they don't want to see it, and don't engage in that behavior. All right, so next we'll go to frauderism. Now, we've talked about frauderism before as a sexual behavior, and I said at the time we're going to get back to this and talk about it as a paraphilia. Frauderism in the non-paraphilic way is just when a person sort of gets sexual pleasure from, rubbing their body against, touching their body against someone else's body. So a frauderist, or as a paraphilia, is going to be someone who touches or rubs their usually clothed genitals against a stranger without their consent or knowledge. This is very common in crowded public spaces, public transit, buses, subways. Frauderists sort of target these because they're able to engage in this behavior without a lot of suspicion often. Places where you would normally be pressed up against someone else, maybe having to move around so that your movement wouldn't be noticeable. So concerts, crowded bars, elevators, these are common places where individuals, frauderists, target their victims. A third of young men in 2 different studies reported engaging in frauderism at least once, usually not to orgasm, but in just sort of rubbing up against or touching. Groping is another way of saying that. An unsuspecting person and trying to kind of get away with it. And a third of college women report being groped in that way. One of the things that happened that I wanted to show you, I'm going to see if this still works. One of the things that this was such a problem in Japan that there were women-only subway cars that were advertised. And this is a place in several cities. Let me see if we can get this video up. Nope. Okay. But the kind of point is that in some places it's become such an issue that to kind of decrease crime, and in Japan was one place where this happened, there were women-only subway cars that were introduced so that there's a victimization-free place to travel to and from work. All right. The final 2 that we're going to talk about are zoophilia, which is also known as bestiality, and autoerotic asphyxia. So zoophilia is when a person has sexual contact with an animal. And again, as I've mentioned before, this is a somewhat more common behavior at certain developmental points without necessarily being something that progresses, I suppose, into adulthood, into a long-term behavior. But we always consider it a problem, even at the adolescent sort of exploration phase, because of the non-consenting animal. 8% of men in Kinsey's study reported this. Remember, that was in the 1930s, reported having had sexual contact with an animal, and 3.6% of women. There were higher rates in rural areas, and these numbers have been relatively supported ever since. It seems to be a somewhat steady rate, more common in rural areas than in urban areas. But that's a sort of a have you ever number, not a regular contact number. And it's much more common to happen in pre-adolescent or adolescent years as kids are sort of figuring out their sexuality and doing some sexual exploration. The most common animals that are the victims of perpetrators of zoophilia are household pets, mostly dogs, and also farm animals. So horses, adults tend to target horses fairly commonly, and smaller sort of farm animals, such as sheep or lambs. When the person is an adult and they don't have human partners, it's considered to be one of the most severe paraphilias. Many of these individuals in adulthood would rather have sex with an animal than their human partner. We also tend to see a lot of people with other kinds of really, so pedophilia, for example, who also will perpetrate with animals. So it's a sort of syndrome of an underlying, really, really severe kind of paraphilia. In adulthood, many of the people with zoophilia would rather have sex with an animal than a human partner, and they tend to transfer their affection and their sexual relationship to that animal as though the animal is a sentient and consenting individual. There's a sort of a trailer for a sort of documentary type film. I think I'll call it a documentary type film called Zoo, that you're welcome to kind of look up, that tries to give a look at sort of the mindset of individuals who engage in this behavior. But it's typically, really severe in terms of the type of mental health that individuals have. There's a disruption from kind of reality and contact. There's a very delusional quality to individuals who are zoophilic. They tend to think this animal loves them back, this animal wants to have sex with them, they're consenting, they'll argue with you about it often. They usually come to treatment only when required to by a court of law because they've gotten caught, and it's a condition of their treatment. Finally, we have autoerotic asphyxia. And this is the one example of a paraphilia that is not about a non-consenting person. So it is something that a person only does to themselves, but we always consider it a paraphilia because it's so dangerous. So autoerotic asphyxia is when a person self-strangulates for the purposes of arousal, and usually for orgasm and orgasm enhancement. And so individuals will basically cut off their airway while masturbating to increase arousal and also to increase the strength of the orgasm. And it leads to an estimated between 250 and 1,000 deaths per year. I know that's a wide range, but it's sometimes difficult to get an exact number on this. And because of the circumstances of death, often people will rule it as a suicide as opposed to autoerotic asphyxia because they aren't sure. There's a stigma associated with sort of, a sexual death, even worse than a suicide, and so it'll get miscategorized. So we think that it happens, for sure, 250 to 1,000 deaths per year. And it's typically considered too dangerous to go untreated because the problem is the point between when a person is cutting off their airflow and then they realize they're in trouble, the point between they realize they're in trouble and then the time they have to act is often not enough time. And so they're dead before they can actually react. They pass out before they can react and then die. There have been a number of deaths that have been assumed to be autoerotic asphyxia, but one confirmed death was the old NXS, this Michael Hutchins. He was the lead singer for NXS. You guys probably don't have any idea who that is, but your parents might. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the causes and how we might treat paraphilias. So social learning theory is probably given the most credence to what might cause a paraphilia to develop. Remember, social learning is that we kind of learn through experiences that we have in life, and that we sort of later through operant and classical conditioning, these things are reinforced over time. So early experiences and experimentation then early on in life are reinforced through arousal and pleasure. So kids who are experimenting, early adolescents who are experimenting and trying new things, they're often, they may be very ashamed of sexuality, or they may not know how to go about seeking sort of partnered sexual activity, and so they engage in these early experiences, and then it feels good. They experience pleasure, they may experience orgasm, and so they're going to be more likely to repeat it, which then just strengthens that arousal and that target response. There's also the case that risky experiences in general, things that increase your adrenaline, that are illicit in nature, can create a general sort of physiological arousal that may be mistaken for sexual arousal or may trigger sexual arousal feelings. And so engaging in illicit, illegal, or risky experiences that themselves can be reinforcing in a sexual way, because that adrenaline rush, that general physiological arousal, can be translated into sexual arousal. We very generally see very poor social skills, particularly in the non-consenting paraphilias. And so paraphilias are often considered to be a sexual escape route. How do you get sexual satisfaction and activity without having good social skills? You transfer your sexual energy onto objects or onto non-consenting individuals, to peeping, to showing people your genitals when they don't need to consent, to animals, etc. There's also some evidence for biological contributions, but this is harder. This research is harder to do, which is why the question mark. We do seem to see that paraphilias run in families. So people who have a paraphilia are 6 times more likely than the general population to have a relative with a paraphilia. And we're more likely to know this, by the way, of the non-consenting paraphilias, usually through criminal records. So people who have criminal records for sexual crimes are 6 times more likely to have a relative with a criminal record for a sexual crime than the general population. But you always want to be careful about whether that's a biological contribution or whether we also have environmental things going on there because of social learning, through modeling, through maybe that child was, victimized in some way by a family member, etc. However, there does seem to be 2 areas where so if we see sort of a genetic contribution, what that genetic contribution might be. One thing is that individuals with paraphilias tend to see, if you look at them in functional MRI studies, they seem to have less active behavioral inhibition systems. The behavioral inhibition system is that part of the brain. It's a communicative pathway that links sort of the limbic system to the prefrontal cortex, the thinking, the part that says, I'm thinking about what I'm doing, and I'm going to make decisions about it. I'm going to plan about it. And this pathway has a lot of serotonin. It's regulated with serotonin neuron activity. And individuals with paraphilias tend to have lower serotonin activity in the behavioral inhibition system. And so what that means is that activities or stimuli that would typically, that a person with a more active behavioral inhibition system would say, stop, don't do that, there's a potential for consequence, ooh, I need to rethink this. People with paraphilias are going to have a less active behavioral inhibition system, so their brain is less likely to tell them, stop, don't do this, this has consequences, this is not a good idea. So in other words, they tend to be more impulsive. And if you're more impulsive and you act a lot more without thinking, you're going to be more likely to engage in a lot of criminal activity, including sexual criminal activity. There's also another line of research that indicates that people who have been incarcerated for sexual paraphilia tend to have temporal lobe deficits, and meaning less gray matter, sort of lower mass in the temporal lobe, which is also involved with kind of thinking behaviors. So these are some potential contributions. How do we treat paraphilias? Well, one of the things that we know is it's very difficult to treat them because there's often a lack of motivation. Court-mandated treatment is almost always less successful than voluntary treatment, although court-mandated treatment can be successful over a long term. Some of the things that have been tried are aversion therapy. So aversion therapy is something that goes on that we look at as a technique of classical conditioning. So the idea is that if you've learned a behavior, you can unlearn it. So if you've learned it because it's very pleasurable, very arousing to engage in it, and it's reinforced through orgasm, then to unlearn it, we need to make it very unpleasant when you engage in it. And so what aversion therapy tries to do is eliminate unwanted desires and behaviors by associating them with some unpleasant experience. So you might, for example, have somebody fantasize about paraphilic behavior while shocking them with electric shock. Or you might have them fantasize about paraphilic behavior while exposing them to really, really unpleasant odors. Or even you could have them fantasize about a paraphilic behavior and then have them introduce into their fantasies another kind of imagery that is highly aversive to them. So, for example, there's a case study that was published by David Barlow, who treated a exhibitionist who had with aversion therapy, and he had him come up with a scenario that would be highly unpleasant for him. And his unpleasant scenario would be his wife and his daughter catching him exposing himself to somebody, and he found that highly aversive. And so they worked up a guided imagery in which he imagined with as much vividness as possible a scenario in which his wife and daughter caught him exposing himself and their reactions, and they puked, and they were so sickened by him and the mean things that they would say to him. And so every time he would fantasize about this, he would have to think about this this really unpleasant experience. And over time, he reported less fantasies and no exposures. Aversion therapy has had some limited success for individuals, but it's not considered overall like a highly efficacious treatment. It's hard to get people to continue it. Cognitive therapy has probably had the best success, and this is where you work with correcting disordered thinking that is used to justify or rationalize these behaviors. And a big part of that is empathy training, trying to get people to empathize or connect with the way that their victims might feel. A lot of people, sexual predators, from voyeurs on up, engage in a lot of distorted justification and rationalization. Well, she or he was having sex anyway, and I was teaching her. I was teaching him something. He really liked it. He had an orgasm. She really liked it. So I'm talking about really pedophilia justifications right now. Well, they never know, so what they don't know can't hurt them. Or I bet she was getting off on it, or later, that she really liked it. Or I bet she was impressed with my penis, or etc. Or for a voyeur, well, if they didn't want to be watched, they would close their blinds, right? So there's a lack of empathy, alarming lack of empathy with their potential victims. And so cognitive therapy works to try to increase empathy training and really correct disordered thinking that is used to justify or rationalize behaviors, and to really confront people and have them work on being more true. No, that animal does not want to have sex with you. We also have to work with relapse prevention. So you need to train a person to avoid or how to cope with situations that trigger behavior. So how is a person going to not put themselves in a position where their impulse control that we've talked about is going to be compromised? So they need to avoid situations in which they might be tempted to engage in behavior, or if they can't avoid it, how do they cope with situations that might in the past have triggered the behavior? And finally, we need social skills training. These individuals really need a lot of work with how to have a conversation, with how to develop intimacy with a consenting adult partner, and basically transition that sexual attraction to an appropriate sexual partner and appropriate sexual behaviors. There are some 12-step addiction programs that will work with sexual paraphilias, but those are a little bit harder to find. But I did just want to mention that they are out there, some kind of self-help sexual addiction programs. Finally, some individuals engage in drug treatment voluntarily. They might take, for example, a big dose of an SSRI or an antidepressant that will functionally reduce arousal or reduce the ability to achieve an erection. So it's kind of a self-induced sexual dysfunction from massive doses of antidepressants. SSRIs also, though, can treat the impulsiveness and the thought process by increasing serotonin. So it's sort of a double treatment. You're decreasing impulsiveness and increasing sort of the ability to think about what you're doing and make decisions, while also probably at the massive doses decreasing sexual functioning. And then Depo-Provera is chemical castration, so that's going to decrease sexual functioning through basically making it pretty impossible to have an erection or an orgasm through any sexual stimuli, but certainly inappropriate. And one old treatment that we don't do anymore, but that some individuals might seek out is actual castration. This is not considered a humane treatment, and we don't do that. Psychologists and psychiatrists don't do that anymore. Okay, so hopefully you've learned a lot this chapter, and I will see you on Monday to talk about sexual violence.